Welcome to the Link Online. And as we see some scenes from across Canada, there's the Skylon, not the Skylon, the CN Tower. Skylon Towers in Niagara Falls, and is rather smaller than that. We have some nice scenes from across Canada, and we are 4 in the studio today with me. We have with us today Lynn Desjardins. What's your subject today, Lynn?
I'll be telling you about what some are calling a mental health crisis among Canadian farmers and ranchers.
And Levon?
Well, I'll talk about this long-awaited apology by the federal government for its treatment of a legendary Indigenous leader.
And Marie-Claude?
Yes, well, we'll talk again about the fishing around Montreal and...
Whether you can eat the fish.
Yeah, that's it.
A subject we're very interested in.
Yeah.
And we have with us also a very special guest, Eilish Quinn, who is the host and director of Eye on the Arctic, and you have won an award, and we're going to get to that just a minute. Now, of course, we have, as mentioned, the team Lynn Desjardins, Levon Savons, Marie-Claude Simard, and in the control booth we have Marc-Antoine Deschamps and Benoit Durand, and of course the ever mysterious Pierre Dutil, who has his back turned to us today. I wonder what that means. Anyway, that's coming up on this edition of The Link Online. All right, a little bit of a rocky start there in the program. But we have good news to start us off with, and that is Eilish Quinn, and you have won an award for some of your work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. We, at Eye on the Arctic, we did an 8-month reporting project looking at the stabbing death of a young man in Nunavik, which is the Inuit region of northern Quebec. And a lot of the really profound difficulties that the family had in the aftermath, the justice system, coroner services, accessing mental health services. And very luckily for us, the project won an award in the United States, the DART Award for Excellence in Reporting on Violence and Trauma.
Okay, and who gives out this award?
It's the DART Foundation that set up this project at Columbia University to really look at the way violence is covered in the media. It's been about 25 years that it's been set up, and they study the way that violence is covered. You know, are victims re-victimized? Is the violence glamorized, or is it in a way that informs society? So they've set this up for 25 years, and they put this prize in place to recognize a variety of reporting projects that cover these issues and that they feel that they do it well.
Now, you mentioned this was Nunavik, and this is northern Quebec, but really it is the Arctic, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, we should say this family, to go on the record with everything that they had to face, was a huge decision for them. There's huge emotional and social costs to speaking out, but we have to say that it's not just in Nunavik that this happens. It happens in Inuit regions and First Nation regions all across northern Canada.
And what about this aspect of talking about this? Because I don't think this is particularly something that is familiar to the Inuit community or the Inuit culture the way it would be in the South, to talk to authorities and explain yourself, or am I wrong on that?
No, I think that's very accurate. And what was interesting is even when I started to talk with the family about doing this project, you know, it's not part of the culture. And a lot of the things that happen, you know, not having access to justice system services, not even understanding how it works, it's very hard for people to complain when they don't even know how it's supposed to work. It really is something that for many families and communities is like a foreign thing, right? But it was interesting with this family, and the way they described it as losing their son to the stabbing death. They've already lost everything. So they said speaking out and going on the record about this, that for them, they think it's time that people across the North need to start talking.
And what are we going to see here? This is a little, or here as the case may be, this is a little aspect of the overall report, right?
Yeah, so we'll look at a video now. This is Bernie Adams. He is the father of Robert Adams, the young man that was stabbed to death in March 2018.
Having a son who was murdered, and my friends in town are hanging themselves left, right, and center. My children's friends are hanging them left, right, and center while the politicians are fighting over scraps. We're begging for help. Nobody's willing to help us. No one. Even the Inuit politicians. They're allowing the victims and the survivors to learn how to deal with the hurt and the pain amongst ourselves, with each other. The blind leading the blind and the deaf leading the deaf. We're trying to heal each other, but we can't because we're all hurting together up here and nobody's willing to help us.
So again, this is the father of the son?
This is the father of the young man that was stabbed to death. And, you know, if we remember, there was there's a suicide crisis in the Arctic all the time, but there was a lot of attention after a string of suicides in Nunavik. And we have to remember that all of this, the stabbing death of this young man, was going at the same time. There were all these suicides going on in Nunavik. And, you know, what we don't remember is during the Vienne Commission, we heard a lot about, you know, how a particular family had difficulty accessing, you know, justice system services somewhere. But what we don't see is the cumulative emotional impact of this over a period of time on not just the family, but the whole community. And as the father said here in his quote, it's everything together, and it's dealing with the stabbing death. At the same time, there's been suicides in the community, and there's just not enough services to address all the needs, and people there are having to figure out how to deal with it themselves.
And so if people want to find out more about this, where can they see this, Alicia?
Yeah, so they can go on the Eye on the Arctic website. The project is called Death in the Arctic, and there's also a link if people prefer to read in French. There's a link for the same project in French.
Well, Alicia Quinn, thank you very much for this, and congratulations on the award.
Thank you so
Yes,
much.
a hearty
Thank you.
congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, coming up next on the program, we're going to hear about an apology, I suppose in some way related to this, a long-standing question about guilt and treason, and that's coming up with Levon. I guess it's coming up now.
It's coming up now.
All right, Levon, this is, again, an issue of reconciliation with the Canadian government and the Indigenous communities here in Canada. And this was another apology delivered by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Could you just give us a background on
Yeah,
this?
it took 134 years for the federal government to finally apologize to the Poundmaker Cree Nation in Saskatchewan for Canada's treatment of Chief Poundmaker. He was wrongfully imprisoned and convicted of felony treason in 1885. The 1880s were a very turbulent period in Canadian history as the country expanded west, and the colonial expansion was facing resistance from the indigenous groups that were living there, but also the Métis. And the Métis rose up in a rebellion led by Louis Riel. And there was this sense, I guess this European colonial masters didn't really differentiate much between the Métis and the Aboriginals and lumped them all together. The Plain Crees actually had some treaties signed with the Crown, the federal government, but Ottawa wasn't holding up its end of the bargain. So in 1885, Chief Poundmaker led his tribe or his nation to Battle Fort, hoping to get some help because the bison population in the Canadian prairies was basically going down, and there were issues with hunger and malnutrition, and the federal government had promised help when they signed this treaty about 9 years prior to this. Unfortunately for this Cree, the federal officials just basically locked themselves up in the fort, never came out, and eventually the Crees returned back to their camp, but they were accused of looting. So the federal government sent about 300 troops, and they attacked the Crees near Cut
Knife Hill. Yeah.
Cut Knife Hill, and this battle ensued, and these Cree warriors managed to beat the federal troops back, and at a very decisive moment in the battle, Chief Poundmaker basically walked into the middle of the fighting with a peace pipe and basically stopped a counterattack by these Cree warriors that would have basically resulted in a massacre of federal troops. Then led a delegation hoping to strike a peace treaty with the federal government, but was promptly arrested and tried and convicted of felony treason and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was eventually released, but he had contracted the fatal lung disease in prison and died soon after. And this is what Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had to say about the fate of Chief Poundmaker and what Canada had done to him.
Today, our government acknowledges that Chief Poundmaker was a peacemaker who never stopped fighting for peace. A leader who time and time again sought to prevent further loss of life in the growing conflict in the prairies. The Government of Canada recognizes that Chief Poundmaker was not a criminal, but someone who worked tirelessly to ensure the survival of his people and hold the Crown accountable to its obligations as laid out in Treaty 6. We recognize that the unjust conviction and imprisonment of Chief Poundmaker had and continues to have a profound impact on the Poundmaker Cree Nation. Chief Poundmaker often spoke of the need to continue moving forward. He said, "We all know the story about the man who sat by the trail too long, and then it grew over, and he could never find his way again. We can never forget what has happened, but we cannot go back, nor can we just sit beside the trail." Well, the Government of Canada has been sitting beside the trail for far too long. And if we are to join the Poundmaker Cree Nation on the path of reconciliation, we need to acknowledge the past and build a foundation for healing and renewed understanding. And so, as an important symbol for our desire to revitalize our relationship with the Poundmaker Cree Nation, I am here today on behalf of the Government of Canada to confirm without reservation that Chief Poundmaker is fully exonerated of any crime or wrongdoing.
And that was an excerpt of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's speech at the Poundmaker Cree Nation in Saskatchewan on Thursday, and you could hear, the applause and the drums there as he officially exonerated Chief Poundmaker and apologized for the treatment he received from the federal government.
134 years.
Yes, took
all right.
Better late than never, I guess.
Even if it's a lot late, I suppose. All right, coming up, we're going to be looking at the difficulties that some farmers are facing. And I suppose this is not just a Canadian issue, but perhaps for farmers in a lot of places around the world. That's coming up. Well, of course, farming is not an easy career, but research suggests that more farmers are, in fact, suffering from mental health problems. And Lynn, this is something that you looked into recently.
I did, Mark. A survey of more than 1,100 farmers and ranchers, Canadians, found that 45% of them reported having high stress. 58% had varying levels of anxiety, and 35% reported depression. Andrea Jones-Bitton is a professor at the University of Guelph, that's in the province of Ontario, and she has for years now been studying farmers' mental health. I called her up and I asked her what might be causing the problems for these Canadian farmers.
I do think that the stresses that farmers are experiencing are a major contributing factor to their mental health now. Some of the stresses that farmers face, they've been around for generations and generations, right? When we think about the impacts of weather, for example, or animal disease and outbreaks, these are things that have been around for a long time. We could argue that climate change is having an impact. Some of the animal disease outbreaks that we see on a much wider scale now. The financial pressures that farmers experience are certainly much higher than they've ever been. There's more social isolation as farms have grown larger, but also are more spread out, that some of the rural communities that used to exist don't really exist anymore. And so that has a big play. And then we're also seeing brand new stressors that our ancestors were less likely to have faced. Animal activism is rising in some areas, and it's having a major impact on farmer mental health, as well as the impact of the perceptions that farmers are feeling that they're being scrutinized constantly via social media. And so all of that, I think, all of these stressors compound and kind of create a perfect storm.
Do farmers typically get help for these mental health problems?
That has changed, I would say, even in the last couple of years. When we first conducted the survey, we did ask people about that. 40% of our participants said that they would seek help for mental health, but they would be worried about what other people think about that. So we know there's, at least historically, there's been a stigma around mental health in the general population, as well as perhaps even more so in the agricultural population. We know that for some people, historically, mental health was seen as a sign of weakness. And so that made help seeking difficult for anyone, really. We've seen the agricultural community grow so much in the last couple of years, where people are talking more about their mental health now, talking more about getting help for their mental health, talking about how they handle the stresses that they have. And so I really think that's reducing some barriers towards help seeking.
Is help available to them?
There are limited farmer-specific resources available to help farmers with their mental health. And some people would say, well, do they need specialized or customized resources? And our research here is saying absolutely they do. So we know that access to medical care in general in rural areas in Canada can be very difficult, even, a family doctor, let alone more specialized services. And farming it's not just an occupation. There's so much tied up in farming and in being a farmer. And it's really important to farmers. Our research is showing that when somebody is providing advice or providing care, that they really have to have a good understanding of the realities of farming.
So Professor Jones-Bitton says that there have been cases of counselors providing advice that just wasn't practical for the farmers. She says that care providers, they don't have to be farmers themselves, but it really would help if they had a basic understanding of what farming is. And as to how important this issue is, well, the professor notes that 1 in 8 Canadians work in agriculture and the agri-food industry, and the sector contributes over $100 billion to the country's annual GDP. Jones-Bitton is advising governments on what she's found, and she's urging them to provide more resources for mental health for Canadian farmers and ranchers. And as she puts it, I think we've got a population here that provides an essential service to the country, and we should do a better job of supporting them. So the full interview is available on the website if you'd like to have a look.
I think one of the things that would be helpful is if farmers were able to take vacations.
Yes. Very hard to get away from it.
When you run a farm, it's like forever. It's a 365-day-a-year operation, especially if you've got animals. And so it's hard to get people to take over so that you can step back and decompress or de-stress.
Yeah.
Well, we do have a good news farm story coming up next on the program. Well, this is a Canadian story that started 40 years ago, and it began with a Canadian broadcaster who was doing a teaching lesson for broadcasters in Africa. And he realized that there was a problem there getting information out to all the small-scale farmers located around the whole continent. And he came up with an idea, and he called it, and this is interesting for us because we're Radio Canada International, he called it Farm Radio International. And what it does is it's a program that creates scripts on tips to help small-scale farmers deal with the various issues and land conditions and climate change and everything else that's happening. Of course, 40 years ago, climate change wasn't an issue. Now it is. These are just some of the things that they do from Ottawa in connection with literally hundreds of radio stations now across Africa. And I spoke with Kevin Perkins, who is the executive director at Farm Radio International in Ottawa, to explain a little bit about how it got its start and how it works.
Well, the first process, the one that was done back 40 years ago, was really low tech. You know, it was George and his wife Janet typing out scripts, like gathering up information that could go in radio script about small-scale farming practices, and typing them up on a typewriter and probably getting them copied somehow, and putting them in envelopes with stamps and mailing them off to various countries in the Commonwealth. Obviously, things have changed since then. We now work with a network of writers in Africa who help write research and write materials for radio. These are scripts and backgrounders and how-to guides and so forth. And then we make them available digitally through internet, email, even social media, WhatsApp groups. There's various ways of getting them out there. So that's how we do what George first did, but in a new way, a more effective way, reaching about 850 radio stations across Africa, and several thousand individual broadcasters all take advantage of those resources. We also work in a few countries where we have staff, about 10 countries where we have people, local African communicators that we employ to work directly with local rural radio stations and help those radio stations produce regular series, regular weekly farm programs, and we sort of work with them to make sure their programs are high quality and reaching lots of farmers. So we write about, when we're doing crops and livestock that are found in large parts of the continent, things like sorghum and rice and maize and millet and cowpeas and pigeon peas and crops like that you really find grown by farmers in many parts of the continent. Likewise with livestock, poultry, goats and lambs and so forth. However, we also write them in such a way and provide a lot of support material for adapting what we present. They're not meant to be really read word for word on the air. They're meant to be source material that the broadcaster adapts and uses for their audience. And of course, broadcasts in the language of their listeners. We produce them in English and French and Swahili and Amharic and Hausa, so a few different languages, but they always have to be, in most cases, they have to be translated on the fly, really, into the language of the listeners. And of course, there's hundreds of those across Africa.
So that was a brief conversation with Kevin Perkins, who's the executive director of Farm Radio International, which is based in Ottawa and, as mentioned at the beginning, has been operating now for 40 years. And again, he said 850 radio stations across Africa, across the various countries, take part in this program and broadcast the scripts and adapt them and work with them and get feedback. They also have they send some of their employees out to speak to the farmers in these various areas and say, what do you think of the program? Did it help you? Did you adapt it some way? And then they take that information back and they rebroadcast the adapted version, say, we suggested this, but now we found out that if you go this way just a little bit, it's probably somewhat better. The other thing that I thought was kind of interesting was the whole idea kind of came from what was going on in Canada decades ago, because we used to have on the National Public Broadcaster a farm radio broadcast, and one aspect of that was they had these little melodramas that they created with farm families, and there were different farm family names used across Canada. The one in Ontario was called the Craigs, and it was like presenting life with the Craigs on a farm, a family farm, and they would weave the tips into the storyline so that while you were being entertained, you were also getting tip information. And so,
Clever.
They're very, very clever.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, so the Farm Radio International now reaches something like almost 50 million adult listeners across Africa. So it's a really
amazing.
Good Canadian international story there. A little bit of a good news story. Now, of course, last week we had you out fishing on the river And that was quite a surprise.
Yes, I hope I could communicate with you my passion for fishing and how fun it is to be out there right in the middle of the St. Lawrence, near a big city like Montreal, doing urban fishing. Well, it's very fun, although maybe I didn't quite explain whether we should eat those fishes or not, and I think it would be responsible to talk about that.
Question all of us had.
Yeah.
Now we have to explain why we're saying that. Can you eat these fishes?
Yes. First of all, look, we're showing a little bit of last week. Okay, go on, Mark. Sorry.
No, because we all said, "Oh, you're fishing in the St. Lawrence just across from Montreal."
Yeah.
And we're going, can you eat those? And why do we have those?
Well, we're in an urban area where there's it's one of the largest cities of Montreal, and I guess we could ask the same question whether we could eat the fishes near Toronto or Vancouver and stuff like that. So
it's because of pollution.
Because of the pollution, exactly. So I spoke with a specialist from the Environment Ministry of Quebec, and I'll tell you right from the top. The fishes are very good to eat, right? In the middle of the river near Montreal. And they're even better than a lot of fishes in other lakes and rivers in...
Really?
Yes.
With all that pollution that goes in.
Exactly. There's an explanation for that. So I spoke with Denis Laliberté, who's a chemist in charge of the network that analyzes the flesh of the fishes in all of the lakes and rivers of Quebec. And what they measure primarily is the level of mercury. Now, mercury, the main source of the main way that the fishes get mercury, the main source of mercury is atmospheric. So all the rivers and lakes in Quebec or Canada are susceptible to get mercury equally. It's not more in Montreal than other lakes, northern lakes. Although you have to point out that when there's spills, of course, in the water, then it would be in a very punctual area, there would be more. But generally, it's atmospheric. So all fishes are susceptible to get it equally everywhere in Quebec. And in Montreal, in the Montreal area, since it's southern, the fishes grow much faster and live much shorter. So they're less long, they're exposed to mercury for a less long period of time.
Which accumulates, so
exactly.
They don't have a long time to accumulate it.
The fish in, let's say the walleye, I don't know if I pronounced that properly.
That is it.
Would live like 6 or 7 years near Montreal, but in northern Quebec, like say Chibougamau or northern Abitibi, it could live up to 20 years. So it would be exposed to mercury much longer. Now, as far as organic contaminants, like sewage and stuff like that, that stuff locates itself in the fat of the animal. And fishes are not very fat animals. So basically they recommend that you don't eat the fat or don't eat the skin. And so that's what it is. I think it's... So there's actually a guide that's published on the website of the environment, and it's very well explained. I think Pierre maybe can show us an image.
He had the
chart you did.
up
Okay,
there,
sorry, I wasn't. Yeah, so it tells you from every river. Yeah, every river. So this is at the station near Boucherville, which is a few kilometers where I was last week. The walleye, you can eat it 8 times a month. If it's a small one, actually small, medium, or large, the size, it's 8 times a month. And so you can find out about each species of fish and each stations. So for sure, I'm going back. I was
just going to say, so for sure I'm going back and bringing
and I'm bringing you guys if you want. And I will cook you, because I have that passion also for cooking and column also in French about cooking. So I will find a good recipe for the St. Lawrence walleye.
Excellent.
But
Fabulous.
now I have to make a point here. We can't do that next week. Because next week we have a special broadcast. We're going to be broadcasting.
Oh, true.
And on a special day. We won't be here on Friday. We'll be here on Facebook on Thursday.
Yes, we're going to Salon d'Immigration.
That's right. At about, was it 12:30 again? 12:30, yes. Not this time, but 12:30. So that's a special program coming up next Thursday. And I'm not sure what they're going to do on Friday. They're going to rebroadcast it or rebroadcast that show. I'm not sure. But so the fish And we...
That means I have 2 weeks to catch a fish.
Yes, let's go. Yes.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. So for Marie-Claude Simard, Lavande Savons, Lynn Desjardins, myself, Pierre Dutil, Marc-André Deschamps, and Benoit Durand, thanks for joining us. Take care until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.